This podcast is about introducing our fans to the animals, plants, and other products that we work with at Josh's Frogs. It's an opportunity to paint a picture of our hobby that is refreshing. We want you guys to be successful with the animals that you're keeping, and we want our hobby to grow ethically and sustainably into the future. Hello, welcome to the Josh's Frogs podcast. I got Brandon with me again. Today we're going to talk about Knob-Tailed Geckos. But before we do that, just want to let you know that the Josh's Frogs podcast is brought to you by none other than joshsfrogs.com. We're your one-stop shop for all your reptile and amphibian needs. We're doing a lot of breeding of animals here on site, from arachnids to lizards to snakes to frogs and toads, of course. We also carry everything you need to take care of those. So we have a great selection of feeder insects. We have all the supplies you need to take care of those animals, from caging to substrates to lighting to heating, all that kind of stuff. And then all the live plants you need as well, too. And so we can ship all that stuff in one shipment to keep the cost of shipping down for you. And then we offer customer service agents available to walk you through anything, as well as a bunch of blogs, articles, and videos, just to make sure that you're successful with what you're keeping. We want you to be successful. So check us out at joshsfrogs.com. Without further ado, welcome Brandon to the podcast again. Talk about knobtails. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about what you do here at Josh's Frogs and some of the animals that you work with here.
Yep. Mentioned it in a couple of podcast episodes prior. I've been working here pretty close actually now to 3 years.
Oh, wow.
It'll be 3 years in the end of this May. I was one of our reptile keepers / breeders. I'm in charge of all of our arid species that we breed in-house. So that's
Cool.
the main thing that I do
Cool.
here.
All right, give us what's over the last few years working here. What was your favorite species to work with? So whether it's something we're working with now or in the past we worked with, what's by far your favorite?
By far, I'd have to give that to the Geleni monitors that we have.
Cool.
We produced a couple of them last year. Branids in general, I think, are one of my main passions within my passion.
Cool.
And they were a unique challenge because working their brumation cycle and also managing them as they have to engage in mock combat in order to want to breed.
Yeah.
Was an interesting challenge.
That's cool. Cool. Would you say that they were the hardest thing that you had to breed here?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now give us the opposite. What's the easiest thing that you think these things are easy to breed? Like we're dialed it in. Like those are the easiest.
Of the stuff that I worked with, we were breeding leopard geckos in-house a few years ago. I mean, they're pretty much a solved issue of many decades at this point.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Tell us a little bit about Knob-Tailed Geckos. Describe what they look like, that kind of stuff. Give us the rundown.
Actually got some friends with me today. One of the things that if you start really getting into Knob-Tailed Geckos that you'll find out very quickly is it's really common to get into genera that have a ton of species, but we only realistically keep like one or two of them. Like scorpion-tailed geckos are a really good example of that. We don't really keep a ton of Pristerus in the trade other than Carteri. Knobtails are not that. We have tons of them, tons of different species. So one of the first things that you'll quickly become acquainted with when you're working with these is Latin, because going by their common names is a nightmare. This little guy that I have with me today is known as Nephurus cinctus. Their common name is the northern banded knob-tailed gecko. You may also sometimes hear them referred to as Nephurus wheeleri cinctus. It's a tad outdated. They used to be classified as a subspecies alongside wheeleri, which is the southern banded knob-tailed gecko. But I think a couple of years ago, they did a pretty extensive study on a lot of the different complexes in Australia, and they elevated both wheeleri and cinctus to full species status. So this little guy is now Nephurus cinctus. They are an arid terrestrial gecko, very similar to leopard geckos in terms of the niche that they occupy. uh, native to, as their name implies, northwestern Australia. Their counterparts in Wheelerai are a little bit more south central Australia. They're really cool little dudes. They got a very, very unique body shape. Their namesake little knobtail. They will wave and bob that as a threat display, as well as getting super tall. If you've been around in the reptile industry, you've probably seen a couple of videos of some knobtails doing their thing, threat displaying. Usually, you'll see Pilbarensis doing that. At least that's the one that most people seem to be working with right now, in like large quantities. But yeah, these guys do it too. They're really fun to watch do that. They kind of just do it whenever you open up their enclosures. They're really kind of spicy little dudes when you go to get them out of the enclosure. But as you can see here, having this guy out and about, once they're in the hand, they're pretty chill. So another really cool thing that they have is kind of like other Eublepharid geckos. They have those really heavy eyelids on top of their eyeballs. That's an adaptation to help keep sand and sediment out of their eyeballs. So when it gets like super dusty or windy or whatever, they'll kind of close their eyes and help protect them.
Oh, that's cool. Now, size-wise, is this full size?
This is essentially an adult male. He's just over like 2.5 years old at this point. The females do get a little bit larger than he does. We don't have an adult female with us today, but we do have what is very close to being a subadult female. Balance all these bin. You can see the size difference there. Yeah. She's still got a little bit of growing to do, but they stay really modestly sized. They're not going to get as big as something like a leopard gecko. There are some other knobtail species that get really huge. Amias are one of my favorites out of this genera of geckos, and they get massive. Like they have heads like really? Sort of like this big. But the Cinctus, they stay really modestly sized, which makes them really conducive to keeping with a lot of the equipment that we commonly see in the trade. So that's a really neat thing about them.
I know like body structure difference than leopard geckos is definitely the tail. Like the leopard geckos using the majority of their tail for fat storage. Is there some fat storage happening in that tail? And is that kind of...
You can see a little bit of that in the little thicker tail at the base there. Again, they are primarily using that as a display structure for both breeding, communication with other mates, as well as for threat display against potential predators. That tail shape can vary pretty substantially depending on species. Those Amiae that I mentioned, they don't have any of that fat reserve at all.
Wow.
They literally just have the little knob tail.
Talk a little bit about the difference between those and leopard geckos then, as far as like how that affects care and affects feeding them.
So as far as husbandry goes, honestly, they're incredibly similar. About the only major difference I would say is, we're getting more and more into this arid bioactive thing.
Yeah.
And dialing in arid bioactive, keeping more akin to how we do it with tropical animals, or you're trying to utilize more like naturalistic style substrates and decor and such to engage in more naturalistic behavior. Classically, with leopard geckos, their husbandry is achieved with relatively simple equipment like paper towel or slate tile and stuff, and human hides and stuff. But again, with that more up-to-date sort of arid bioactive keeping, we're finding a lot of success on keeping them in diggable substrate that they can access those human microclimates in. With these knobtails, I would say that you can also keep them in that more classic sort of Spartan arid setup. But I find that they, more so than leopard geckos, really, really prefer and appreciate all of that nice sandy, loamy digging medium in their enclosures. So that's kind of the main way that I recommend keeping these guys is sandy loam soil, which is really easy to achieve. You can find all kinds of guides on it online.
Yep.
I do them on about 4 inches or so of substrate. You can technically get away with a little bit less than that, but again, these guys love to dig. It's the main thing they're doing in their tanks. And make sure that it all goes in nice and not damp or wet, but moist, and let the top layer dry out in between mistings, which pretty much I'm just misting to rehydrate the substrate when it starts to dry out, and that typically winds up being about every 2 to 3 times a week. So,
And with that amount of substrate, can you give us a guide on like how much water you're actually putting into the enclosure? Because 4 inches, it sounds like a lot of substrate.
yeah,
Are you really soaking it?
but when you're doing a sandy loam soil, what's going to happen is the first, like the bottom 3 and 3/4 inches or so of the substrate is going to stay moist regardless of the above ground conditions, unless you have a particularly hot day or intense lighting conditions on your enclosure.
Mhm.
So within a couple of days, you have that nice little top 1/4 to 1/2 inch layer of substrate that's dried out that you go and then and rehydrate with a misting. But all that stuff underneath there is going to stay nice and moist for them, and that's what they're doing in the wild. And that's the reason that they like digging so much, is they're seeking out those cooler, more humid microclimates, because where these guys come from, they are built to tolerate a lot drier of conditions than even something like a leopard gecko. Because if you've seen anything about Australia, it can be a fairly biodiverse continent.
Mhm.
It's got more temperate forested areas. It's actually got tropical rainforests to the far north.
Mhm.
Knobtails come from where, if you have that classic vista of Australia in mind, of parched, harsh red sands and 200-degree surface temps on the soil during the heat of the summer, that's where these guys come from. So they are really tolerant to periods of drought and dryness and that stuff in general, but they're managing to do that because, again, they are seeking out those more humid, cool microclimates during the day to try to escape that that afternoon sun. So
Now I know typically with leopard geckos, and very simple setups, doing a lot of belly heat, with those types of enclosures. Guessing with 4 inches, you're not heating it that way. How are you providing some
no.
heat for these guys?
Yeah, I provide my heat in those style setups with overhead incandescent lighting. So things like halogen bulbs and daytime basking bulbs and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if we've done a talk or not on cryptic basking
Mm.
and like lighting in general. But these guys are going to be another gecko that's going to be a really avid cryptic basker. So if you set up some decor for them to dig underneath your basking bulb, they'll go underneath that piece of cork when they want to thermoregulate and warm up and digest and stuff. So they're going to get a lot of that radiant heat from the decor above.
Mm.
So that's typically how I heat mine. As well as you can get away with a lot of different things depending on how you actually manage the temperature in your own home. I know not everybody wants to have their whole house be like 78, 80 degrees,
Yeah.
but for those of us that set up reptile rooms,
Yep.
depending on what you're keeping in there, is something to consider.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. Now, cage, other considerations for caging besides the 4 inches, and then you talked a little bit about the cryptic basking, and so you've got some layering that you're doing on top of the anything else that you keep in mind when you're setting up an enclosure?
Yep, plenty of opportunities like you were talking about in terms of being able to dig under and have stuff that support their burrows.
Mm.
All of that cage decor that I was talking about, you want to make sure that it's actually being secured by the bottom of the enclosure, or like secured otherwise to the side walls and not being propped up by the substrate, because you don't want them to start digging down and then have all that support structure for that piece of decor go away, and then it collapses on them, and they're not able to get out. So you really want to make sure all that decor is set up smartly, so that it's all supported. It's one of the bigger considerations I can give you as far as setup goes. They're not really kept with ultraviolet lighting a lot of the time. I firmly believe in giving all life period ultraviolet lighting whenever my budget allows for it. Again, with that same thing with that cryptic basking, where they're going to be able to absorb a lot of that heat radiantly from inside their burrow. Those UV wavelengths are going to be bouncing off of all of the enclosure decor, so they'll incidentally absorb a little bit of it inside of their burrows. And additionally, it helps them really inform their circadian rhythm better. When you're keeping them sort of Spartan rack style, you're really not giving your gecko a ton of light to work with. And they are a crepuscular species that is more active when it's darker out, but that still means that they're using that natural sunlight to inform that decision. So when you keep them in a bioactive air and terrarium, what you're doing is you're allowing them to make those natural decisions regarding when they're going to sleep, when they're going active, as they would in their native range of Australia. And anytime that you're engaging with more naturalistic behaviors like that, it directly translates into happier, healthier geckos. So
talk a little bit about specifics. What's the temperature / humidity you're going for, and then also are you providing standing water for them?
Temp wise, I typically shoot for roughly mid 70s to high 70s ambient. Then basking wise, as long as they have access to a pocket that's around like 90 to 95. So pretty modest temp requirements. Then what else?
Water. Are you providing standing water for them?
They get basically all of the moisture that they need through both those mistings and the food that they're eating, which is going to be all your classic insect feeders like crickets and roaches and such. I have tried offering standing water to Knob-Tailed Geckos in the past. Honestly, I've never seen them utilize it. It just turns into an extra piece of maintenance in the enclosure. So it's like, if they're not going to use it, why even bother? You can provide it. I'm just saying I wouldn't expect them to actually utilize it like you'd imagine them doing it. They may poop in it. Which might make spot cleaning a little bit easier. But that's about it. So
cool. You mentioned feeding crickets, roaches. Anything else that you're recommending for those guys? Or recommending against?
Just make sure, like any other air gecko, that you're really doing due diligence when you're balancing your diets. People can fall into certain habits when they feed off specific kinds of feeder insects. I think last time I looked at a study, they're eating mostly like beetles and spiders and all that kind of stuff out where they come from. So they, diet-wise, they're selected for a pretty narrow range of insects. So you're going to be able to cover most of your bases with, again, that sort of cricket, roach-heavy diet. I don't particularly care for mealworms as a staple. They're super high in chitin and phosphorus, which can lead to certain problems if you're relying on it as a staple feeder. Waxworms are another one that's definitely a treat-only sort of thing. They're super fatty and stuff. You know, a lot of your typical rules that you're abiding by with leopard gecko husbandry, if you apply it to knobtails diet-wise, you're going to be pretty fine. I do supplement with calcium vitamin supplements with low amounts of D3. We use Repashy's calcium plus low D in-house. They're going to hopefully get the majority of the D3 that they need by cryptically absorbing ultraviolet lighting, as well as getting it through what is in the insects. But it's still not a bad idea to offer that supplemental D3. Vitamin D3 in general is really hard to overdose in reptiles. So especially if you're using those supplements that are more so designed for just kind of basically being a fail-safe as opposed to being a direct D3 supplement, you'll be fine.
That's cool. That's cool. Talk a little bit about breeding. Are we keeping males and females together, introducing them? What's the process that we're getting to get
Yep.
eggs?
The really cool part, if you do those sandy loam arid bioactive setups, is it's the perfect medium for them to lay their eggs in. Basically, once you set them up like that, breeding wise, we just full nest viv them. And the really cool thing is it's perfect conditions for their eggs to actually do a little bit of their development in cage. I've actually had knobtails hatch out like in the tanks before, and I'll open up a tank one day and I just find babies. So if you miss an egg check or two, it's really forgiving. But otherwise, if you're not doing that kind of style of keeping, especially if you're breeding, you're going to want to provide a nice humid hide with diggable substrate, something like filled with cocoa fiber or whatever will be ideal for them to lay their eggs in. Brumation and break periods are heavily encouraged for proper egg cycling. Knob-Tailed Geckos can actually be pretty easy to overbreed, a lot like other arid geckos. And the thing about knobtails is if you do that, leopard geckos tend to give and give and give until their little bodies can't give anymore.
Yeah.
Knobtails will give for a couple of years, and then they will turn off the production factory forever.
Oh, wow.
So I do typically keep my knobtails cohabitated for the entire breeding season when you are doing them in those properly well built out setups, which we were using 20-gallon longs, I think, and that was providing enough space for them to both get what they need. And then providing them breaks during the brumation winter season so that they're definitely not trying to breed anymore, and so that they can also have a little break from their breeding season. A lot of people also do keep them separately and introduce as needed for babies. They will produce, I think they do produce fairly regularly through sperm retention. So
cool. You talked a little bit about brumation. Can you give us a quick definition and practically how you do that with those guys?
Brumation is essentially the reptile lizard version of hibernation in mammals. When conditions and resources are not ideal, they go and they shut down their bodies to a degree. They don't go like completely lifeless, but they'll do really cool things like reducing their heartbeat and other like organic processes inside their body in order to really sort of hold on to and utilize as little nutrients as possible. And there's something about that process that, especially once you have that spike back up again in temps and resources, that really encourages their systems to want to cycle eggs naturally. So, and typically brumation is accomplished via, again, lowered temperatures and reduced resources, i.e. food.
Yeah.
So brumation is a subject that probably deserves its own podcast episode. But the skinny of it is make sure that your animals will clear the food before going through with it, make sure that they're healthy and that they don't have like a super high parasite load or anything like that, and then reduce temps usually for about 1 to 2 months and then bring them back up. For Knob-Tailed Geckos, it's going to be usually down in like the mid-low 60s that you're going to go for ambiently when you're doing a brumation cycle.
Oh, cool. All right. Any last advice for anybody that's considering getting some knobtails? Maybe they had some experience with leopard geckos in the past. What are some things to keep in mind to be successful?
Knobtails kind of have this like reputation for being like harder to work with for some reason. Honestly, I would definitely label this grouping of geckos as a fairly beginner-friendly species. They're really cool and really exotic looking compared to what we have a lot of. And they've sort of been in this weird space in the hobby where everybody thinks they're going to take off and they kind of just don't. They kind of just stay in their own little niche in the market, which honestly, that might be to their benefit. It means that we're not trying to just produce thousands and thousands of them arbitrarily. But I think they're one of the most underrated gecko groupings in the entire hobby. I'd really love to see more and more people get into them.
Cool.
So if you're looking at a Knob-Tailed Gecko and you're worried about being a first-time reptile keeper, as long as you do your research and know what you're getting, I think it's really easy to be pretty successful with these guys at your first try at herp keeping.
That's cool. That's cool. All right, Brandon, we're going to move into the lightning round. Give us the first answer that comes to your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And if you need to skip, you can skip, but I think you've done really good on these in the past. All right. If money and space were no issue, what's the next pet that you would get?
The next pet that I'd get. Might be fun to actually venture outside of the reptile herp realm for once. I really love the idea of pet foxes. But there's a lot of issues with keeping pet foxes. That's why the prerequisite to answering that question is if money and space weren't an issue.
Yep.
Because you don't want them in your house. Their pee stinks real bad.
All right. Besides Josh's Frogs, what's one other business that's producing really cool products, or a breeder that's breeding some really cool animals?
There's one that I want to say, but I don't think I'm allowed to say it right now.
Oh no.
There's one herb keeper actually in Michigan, more towards Metro Detroit. Her socials are Shannon's Reptile Room, and she's keeping a ton of really cool things. She's got a couple of tree monitors. She's got some leaf tips. She's got some Fantasticus. A bunch of really cool kind of like expert level species, and she's taking care of them super well. So it's been really fun to watch her build her collection and grow her social media out a little bit more.
That's cool. I love it when people niche down and like do something different than everybody else is doing. All right. What's your new favorite animal or plant in the entire world?
My current favorite plant actually is spider plants. And that's because I recently went and upgraded my Merauke blue tongue skink enclosure at home. He's in like this enormous 5x3 with like a foot deep of substrate at home. And I put spider plants in as one of the new plants I was trying out, because blue tongues are infamous for just destroying everything you put in there. Deep substrate is king, because that spider plant has absolutely exploded and thrown pups all over my enclosure.
That's cool. That's cool. I love the fat guys destroying all the plants.
Oh yeah.
You have an hour of free time. What are you doing with that hour? What are you doing nowadays?
I've been digging into Elden Ring recently. I know it's been out for a couple of years, and I finally went and took a plunge into it, and I've been having fun.
That's cool. That's cool. All right, you got a bunch of people listening to you. What's one piece of advice or one thing you'd like to remind people of?
Yeah, I saw this out on Facebook the other day. We give a lot of advice here to newer keepers, but I feel like some of the experts could use some advice as well. If we want this hobby to grow, we got to start being nicer to newer keepers. It's really easy to get super passionate about your reptiles and your herps, especially when you make a lot of these same mistakes yourself. But again, you started from somewhere at some point, and no one's going to listen to advice that's not given in a way that's constructive. So make sure that you're giving your advice in order to educate and elevate, not to win internet points.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Brandon. You can check out Brandon's on a bunch of other podcasts with us. He's done a bunch of videos, done some articles and stuff like that. Check out his stuff. He's always willing and ready to drop some knowledge bombs on us. So thanks a lot, Brandon. Appreciate you educating us on Knobtails.
Happy to do it.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoy this content and want to stay up to date, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow us across social media. We always want to bring you the best content, so let us know what you think in the comments. And for all your reptile and amphibian needs, be sure to check us out at joshsfrogs.com. We have an amazing selection. Until next time, stay curious, stay froggy, and keep exploring.